The Saskatoon Heritage Society was founded in 1976 following public concern over the demolition of the Standard Trust building and protecting other buildings from their demise. A non-profit charitable organization, the Saskatoon Heritage Society is dedicated to the preservation of buildings, neighborhoods, and sites in Saskatoon which are of historical and aesthetic value. The Society also encourages Saskatoonians to take an active interest in the history of their city. In early 1976, William Sarjeant wrote an article called Prairie Law, published in the spring issue of Heritage Canada magazine. He discussed the progress in the past few years in Saskatoon of dealing with historic landmarks. Sarjeant and his wife Peggy moved to Saskatoon, and in 1972 he was a member of the Saskatoon Environmental Society, who pushed for the introduction of a heritage bill. They wrote letters to everyone in the Legislative Assembly and got much support. Sarjeant gave a speech on behalf of that society to an open session of the provincial cabinet in October 1974. He focused his attention on buildings that were at that time under threat of demolition by developers. The Saskatchewan Heritage Act received royal assent in April 1975. The Environmental Society had also been holding monthly meetings in a special committee of aldermen and citizens. Sarjeant was the chair of the committee. They put together a list of all pre-1940 buildings worthy of preservation, and the list was published in 1975. At that time, that list may have been the reason the university greenhouses were saved. They had been planned for demolition, as well as the Royal Bank of Canada building on 2nd Avenue South. In the magazine article, Sarjeant stated the greatest success in the early years was helping the general public be more aware of architectural historic buildings. In that same issue of Heritage Canada magazine, Donald Kerr wrote an article called Saskatoon. He pointed out some of the most historic buildings we had already lost, plus new ones at risk. He wrote at length about the Standard Trust building. The building was a great souvenir of the last real estate building boom in Saskatoon right before World War I. The building sat at the northeast corner of 22nd Street and 3rd Avenue. Kerr called it public vandalism to destroy a historic building which easily could have been saved. It was demolished to simply make way for some trees and a plot of grass at the corner of the new $21 million sturdy stone building. Kerr called the Standard Trust building the most lonely building in downtown. It was built with windowless brick walls on the north and east sides, expecting to be surrounded by more high-rises that never came when the building boom ended. This early 1976 magazine also talked about the rumors of the Capitol Theatre being up for sale. No one wanted to predict that 3 years later that building would be secretly demolished in the middle of the night. With the growth in population, new high-rise apartments were also all the rage. The city was called the City of Bridges, but Don Kerr said maybe we would now be called the City of the Elevator Shaft. Interestingly, the Capitol Theatre may have had a better chance of survival if it was simply older. Bill Delaney wrote a lengthy history of all these organizations and the challenges they faced, published in Saskatoon History Review No. 14 in 1999. And Peggy Sarjeant wrote the timeline of 100 Years of Heritage Preservation, 1911 to 2011, published in Saskatoon History Review No. 25 in 2012. And yes, we do have copies of both of these available from the Saskatoon Heritage Society. I'm going to highlight some featured important moments in heritage history from Peggy's article here to give an overview of some early issues we have faced in dealing with heritage in Saskatoon. If you stood downtown in Saskatoon in 1965, you would have seen an entire area comprised of buildings built between 1906 and 1930. When Mayor Sid Buchwald planned to remove the CNR Railway out of the downtown, everyone was excited for a great new change in urban renewal. Nobody picketed against the massive changes that were going to happen, including not only the railway station and its tracks, but all of the historic major buildings between 19th and 23rd Streets and between Idlewild and 1st Avenue. This was the greatest change in turnover in our city's history. Nobody seemed to quite value our history and past yet. People would have said, our city's not old enough yet, so what possible heritage did we have to be concerned with? But many grand historic buildings came down in the name of progress. Instead, moving forward, we gained new buildings downtown, like the CN Tower, Midtown Plaza, Sears, Eaton's, the new YMCA, and the Centennial Auditorium building. Now, 55 years later, some of these buildings are ready to be replaced. The city was in a major building boom in the 60s, including tons of new high-rise apartments, as well as taking down pioneer houses and even complete streets. As time goes by, the public forgets. A few historic articles and photographs is all we have left to tell stories. What if the public's view of heritage had been established a decade earlier? Maybe some of these would have been saved or history rewritten. Here is a slideshow of photos of a small sample of buildings that left us in the decade leading up to the formation of the Heritage Society and also of our first decade. Plus, some main points of historical interest as originally compiled by Peggy Sarjeant relating to heritage in Saskatoon. In 1911, the Stone School, the Temperance Colony's first schoolhouse built in 1887 and the direct precursor of the current Victoria School, was transferred to the university campus under the initiative of the IODE and William P. Bate, then Secretary to the Public School Board. This is the earliest surviving public building in Saskatoon and the earliest known instance of the preservation of built heritage in Saskatoon. In 1949, the Western Development Museum in Saskatoon opened its first location, a hangar at the airport. The WDM was created by provincial statute in 1949, and Joe Phelps was its first board chair. In 1952, the museum moved to a relocated hangar on 11th Street West, and then to a brand new facility on Lorne Avenue in 1972, where it still is. George Shepard was appointed curator in 1953 and served for 20 years. The seventh house ever built in Saskatoon back in 1884 was used by the Temperance Colonization Society. It would also be the Joseph Fletcher House at 526 Main Street. Built in 1884, it was in rough shape when the OK Economy store wanted to build on the lot and use the space of the house for the back of their parking lot. So in 1956, $1,000 was raised to move the historic Pioneer House to the Western Development Museum property when it was on 11th Street at that time. And you can see the house was moved, and they moved it again to the exhibition grounds in 1977, but the house was in such bad repair that in 1986 they demolished the house near the new WDM. You can see here where the property had been at the back of the grocery store parking lot. In 1958, the Damer apartment block at 744 Spadina Crescent East was to be demolished, as well as the houses around it, to make way for the brand new Medical Arts building on Spadina. And Robert Hynett had lived in this house, but was forced to move when it was torn down. On the left, you'll see the classic King George Hotel, still standing, but now condos. But on the right, we see the grand J.F. Cairns department store built in 1913. He sold it to the Hudson's Bay Company in the 1920s, and that's what you see in this 1958 photo. But this building was demolished because the Hudson's Bay Company wanted a brand new modern building. So they built a new one at that time, and it's the same shape, and it's still standing, and it's now condos. The courthouse was located on 21st Street East at the northwest corner of 4th Avenue. This is where everyone went for 52 years, 1907 to 1959. Currently, it is the Myers Norris Penny building, which also includes the UPS store at that corner, which is just next to the old Edens building, which is now the Saskatoon School Board. 1960 to 1964, the railway moves out of downtown. The process for removing the downtown railway yards, the 1938 CN railway station facing 21st Street, and a number of adjacent structures was undertaken to make way for the Midtown Plaza and the Centennial Auditorium. In 1964, the last passenger train passed through the CNR station, and passenger rail service was moved to the edge of the city. The CNR bridge was replaced in 1965 by the Senator Sid Buckwold Bridge. formerly the Idlewild Freeway Bridge. The CP Rail Station, the CPR Bridge downstream from the weir, and the Southern CNR Bridge, formerly the Grand Trunk Pacific Bridge, remain to remind us of Saskatoon's rich railway heritage. Here's a photo of downtown in 1960, the way it used to be when we had the railway and the bridge downtown. In 1960, at 712 Dufferin Avenue, the original Northwest Mounted Police Barracks, used for a settlers' council of war during the Louis Riel uprising, was demolished under protest. This was the first time the public complained about a historic building being demolished. It is now currently an apartment building. The Masonic Temple and Dominion Land Titles Building was located at 402 21st Street East. This is the northeast corner of 4th Avenue. You can see beside it is the Oddfellows Building, which is still standing today. And the Masonic Temple was demolished in 1962. It currently is the high-rise office building with Niche Dental on the corner. At one time, possibly the biggest hotel in Saskatoon, the Western Hotel, built in 1903 by James Flanagan on 2nd Avenue and 21st Street. It had gone through many changes. Originally, it was angled at that corner. Then they straightened it up. Then they built an addition. And then by 1910, moved it over and changed the direction completely so that it was facing west. By 1962, the 59-year-old hotel was demolished to make room for the Woolworths department store, which created a new L shape of their business. So you could walk in on either 2nd Avenue South or 21st Street. And you can see that the TD Bank was built at the corner. Now in its current location, you can see it's the Saskatchewan Social Services Building at 158 2nd Avenue South. The original Dr. Willoughby Farmhouse was the first house ever built on 20th Street in 1903. He sold the house in 1906 and it became the very original St. Paul's Hospital building. It was demolished in 1962 to make way for the third St. Paul's Hospital, and that original farmhouse was located here close to 20th Street, sort of in the center of this photo. The second St. Paul's Hospital was a grand brick building built facing Avenue P. And you can see the large building here, still with the original Willoughby Farmhouse, also in this photo on the left. And that was also demolished. Since 1962, there have been many updates to the building, and we can see how large the current St. Paul's Hospital is here at 20th and Avenue P. For 52 years, the city market square with the farmers market was located here at this building on Idlewild, which was Avenue A at the time, and 21st Street. It was demolished in 1963. It would become the new fire hall station on Idlewild Drive. But the fire hall that preceded that one was Fire Hall number 2. It was located 1 block west on 21st and Avenue B. And it was used for about 50 years. It was demolished in 1964. Currently, it's mostly a parking lot for the Crocus Building at 107 Avenue B South, and next to it is Atmosphere. The CNR railway station had changed numerous times over the years, but the grand final version was built in 1938, and it wasn't that old when it came down in 1964 when the railway was removed from the station. This is where the center of the Midtown Plaza would be constructed. Jason Graham built a house at 624 Spadina Crescent East back around 1906. It would later become J.F. Cairns Department Store's house for about 15 years. It was demolished in 1964 and became the Cavalier Towers location, which also is now James Hotel. Here you can see part of the CNR railway yards and the large International Harvester Company of Canada building on 22nd Street. Here we are looking northwest. You can see the CPR station in the background. This building and all the buildings pretty well in this photo nearby were demolished, and is now the location of the Centennial Auditorium. Here's a photo from the same angle, a little bit higher. You can still see the CPR station in the background, and you can see a lot of new buildings built since the 60s. A lot of people remember the pedestrian overhead bridge, which ran down 20th Street over the railway tracks from 1st Avenue to Avenue A. And that was there also over 50 years, demolished in 1964, and almost every single building in this photo is now gone. Here's the current map of it. You can see 20th Street was actually turned into a road for the first time. Cars had never driven down 20th Street because the railroad tracks had been here for 74 years. Finally, in the mid-60s, 20th Street connected the west and the east. And if you're wondering where that pedestrian bridge, it was basically where those clump of trees were at the meeting of 20th and Idlewild. In this photo on 23rd Street, you can see Fire Hall number 1 and the city's main public library, also J.H. Early's Dodge Service, and the police station in the background on 4th Avenue. These buildings were mostly taken out in 1965 to build the grand new public library, now called the Francis Morrison Public Library, built in 1965. And you can see the sturdy stone building was later built on the right side. The Empress Hotel was Nutana's Grand Hotel, built in 1907, also called the Saskatchewan Hotel at one time. It later became the Pimohaila Ukrainian Institute building. And currently, you can see it is an apartment building at this corner of Main and Victoria. When the railway was removed, they built a brand new Idlewild Freeway Bridge. And here we are on the south side of the river, where we have Lorne Avenue and Poplar Crescent. Much of Lorne Avenue was removed to make the new freeway, and 50 houses were removed or demolished from this area to make this new project. On Broadway Avenue, at the corner of Main and the 800 block, was the Red Robin Cafe, one of the most popular stops on Broadway for many decades. The building here on the corner was demolished in 1965. It would become a Royal Bank, which was then demolished, and now we have a high-rise apartment building on that very corner. Downtown, at the busy corner of 1st Avenue North and 22nd Street, on the west side, was the Massey Harris Building. Many events were held here because this was possibly the biggest building. This was demolished in 1965, and 10 years later, they would build the Holiday Inn Hotel at this corner. It is now currently the Hilton Garden Inn. At 5 corners on Broadway and 12th Street, there was a vintage building called the Swanee Building. It was at 622 Broadway. At one time, it had Pinder's Drugs located in it. Demolished in 1965. It is now basically the parking lot here in front of the Broadway Roastery Building. In 1966, approximately half of the Sutherland Forest Nursery Station was transferred to the city of Saskatoon for use as a park. This became known as the Forestry Farm Park and was subsequently recognized as a National Historic Site in 1991. In the Nutana area, we had the old Nutana Curling Rink building at Main Street and Dufferin at the southwest corner, and it was demolished in 1966 to make way for a brand new apartment high-rise called Nutana Towers. Just to the west of the railroad tracks downtown was the Layer Block on Avenue A. Here we're looking at the back of the building, and you can see how close it was to some of the railway tracks. Walter Cycle and the San store were both located here, and all these were demolished again to make way for the new Idlewild Freeway ramp. So these buildings were literally where the ramp is now, close to 20th Street. The Imperial Bank of Commerce had built their classic building pre-World War I. And in 1967, they decided to demolish their building and build a grand new building, which they did here at the corner of 21st Street and 2nd Avenue South. On March 4th, 1967, the local history room opened in the main library, now called the Francis Morrison Library, of the Saskatoon Public Library. The small space has become a major stop for anyone doing local history research in Saskatoon. It houses a magnificent collection of archival photographs of Saskatoon and surrounding area. Wilbur Lepp was its first librarian. On 1st Avenue North on the 200 block, we had the Western Grocers building, and that was there for 50 years. And you can see how the road dips right to the left of it. That's where the 23rd Street subway used to be, where you would drive down and go underneath the railway tracks. Well, eventually, the other buildings to the right of the Western Grocer building were also demolished, as you can see in this new picture, where most of the buildings on the left side of the block are newer. St. Paul's High School sat at 415 22nd Street East in the middle of the block and was just a little bit west of St. Paul's Church. And so we're just looking at this photo, which is the south side of 22nd Street and just a bit east of 4th Avenue. Well, the high school was demolished in 1968 to make way for the new Co-op building at 401 22nd Street East, a high-rise, and you can see that the other part of the block was now used by the Sheraton Cavalier. In 1969, the Co-op Center at 321 22nd Street East had a major fire and was destroyed. The building was opened in 1952. It was only 17 years old. In recent decades, it is a multi-use business building here at the corner of 4th and 22nd. Archie McNabb had one of the finest houses ever built in Saskatoon at 703 Melrose Street. And it was demolished in 1969 to make way for a large new apartment building. Downtown, the YMCA building opened in 1913 and was used until 1969 when they opened a new building next door to the Centennial Auditorium. So this grand building was demolished in 1971. It would later, by the late 70s, be replaced with a new Remay office building, which is now Asante. In 1972, William Sarjeant, newly arrived from England, joined the board of the recently formed Saskatoon Environmental Society and was charged with initiating action on the issue of preservation of our historic urban environment. And in 1973, publication of Saskatoon's Historic Buildings and Sites by Sally Clubb and William Sarjeant was published by the Saskatoon Environmental Society. In 1973, there was a campaign to save the CP rail station on Idlewild. Concern grew over rumors that CP Rail was considering closing its line through the city center, leading to the possibility of the future demolition of the historic CP Rail station built in 1907. This led to a campaign by a group known as Save Our Station and the Saskatoon Environmental Society, headed by William Sarjeant. This was the catalyst for a wider campaign by the SCS to identify and protect buildings and sites of historic and architectural value, which eventually led to the formation of the Special Listing Committee. Also in 1973, Saving the Riverbank, Canorama, and the beginnings of Meewasin. A group calling themselves the Saskatoon Citizens Committee launched a protest against the proposed Canorama development in River Heights, which would have seen riverside development alongside a northern extension of Spadina Crescent. The Environmental Society became involved, and the protest continued to snowball. Private citizens, led by Joanna Miller, organized a petition, and when the city decided to hold a public hearing on January 12, 1974, council was overwhelmed by the turnout. The protest resulted in a land exchange and the acquisition by the city of what is now Meewasin Park. The protest was also the catalyst for a federal-provincial 1976 study of the whole riverbank area. This led to the creation of the Meewasin Valley Authority in 1979. In 1974, the original 1908 post office building was demolished. It was used for over 50 years at the busy corner of 1st Avenue South and 21st Street. It would become the RCMP building before they moved to 8th Street. This building demolished in 1974 for the brand new Royal Bank building, which has sat there for over 50 years now. In 1974, publication of Saskatoon, The Growth of a City by William Delaney and William Sarjeant was published. In May 1974, the first City Heritage Committee. Following the lobbying campaign by the SCS begun in 1972, City Council agreed to appoint a special committee for the identification and listing of historic buildings and sites, which reported to the Planning and Development Committee. The chair throughout its existence, 1974 to 79, was William Sarjeant. The committee developed a set of criteria for evaluating buildings and sites based on architectural, contextual, and historical importance, and compiled a list of significant historic buildings built prior to 1940. At 215 22nd Street West, we have the old Saskatoon Quick Freeze building. It was built in 1909. Quick Freeze was there in the last few decades. This building was demolished in 1974. And it would become Anderson's Auto Care. And now Village Auto Sales owns the building. In March 1975, the demolition of the TD Toronto Dominion Bank on 2nd Avenue South. In April, Saskatchewan Heritage Act was enacted. This first attempt at heritage legislation was weak and proved unworkable. In April 1976, demolition of the Standard Trust building on the northeast corner of 3rd Avenue and 22nd Street to make way for the new sturdy stone building. Here is the Toronto Dominion Bank at 116 2nd Avenue South, built in 1909, torn down in 1975, next to the Paramount Theatre, originally called the Daylight Theatre. It is now the National Bank at that location. On June 10th, 1976, the Saskatoon Heritage Society is born. The society was created to provide an independent voice on heritage matters and grew out of the frustration over the demolition of the Standard Trust building. Its founding board members included President Don Kerr. On October 21st, the Heritage Society held its first public meeting, hosting a presentation by R.A.J. Phillips, Executive Director of the recently formed Heritage Canada Foundation. Here is the Sturdy Stone Centre, which was built, and you can see right on the corner is where the Standard Trust building had stood. You can see how it didn't have windows on two of the sides. Here we have the Heritage Society founding meeting at the Public Library downtown. Rosary Hall was built in the 1920s and was in this location for 50 years with expansions, and you can see it's just across the street directly from the Besborough Hotel. This is at 534 Spadina Crescent East and at the corner of 421 21st Street East. And they were in a rush to tear this down, but interestingly, 50 years later, it is still an empty parking lot at the major corner in front of the Besborough Hotel. The Metropolitan Store was a popular department store at the corner of 22nd and 2nd Avenue South, demolished in 1977 at 117 2nd Avenue South. It became the Scotia Bank, a grand glass window building on the corner, still standing. In 1977, Nutana fights to save its historic character and inspires other core neighborhoods. In 1977, the Nutana Residents Association was formed, the first formal residents association in Saskatoon. The association campaigned to save Nutana's older housing stock, which was being rapidly demolished in favor of high-rise housing as a result of the introduction of a federal incentives program. In the fall of 1977, residents presented a petition to council calling for the rezoning of the neighborhood to single or two-unit dwellings. Petitions followed from the other core neighborhoods. In 1978, this led to a development freeze across all the core neighborhoods and the implementation of the Core Neighborhood Study. The study took over 3 years to complete and led to the overhaul of the city's development plan. This project was instrumental in saving the historic character of the older residential areas of the city. In the spring of 1977, the Royal Bank building on 2nd Avenue South was saved. The owner was encouraged by heritage advocates and well-known architect Roger Walls to renovate and adapt his building for a new use. This is the only remaining bank building from Saskatoon's boomtime era right before World War I. It now forms part of what would become the Odeon Center and is now currently a different nightclub. The former Union Bank building at 2nd Avenue and 21st Street is actually older, built in 1909 and still standing. In the fall of 1977, the Heritage Society joined the campaign to save the facade of the Bank of Nova Scotia at 133 2nd Avenue South. The city of Saskatoon was offered a chance to purchase the Capitol Theatre for $677,000 in 1977, but the city refused the purchase. The Star Phoenix started publishing many articles relating to heritage and older buildings at this time. In 1979, the Argue Block at 626 Broadway Avenue and Five Corners was demolished. This was the famous building housing Harrington Jewelers for many decades, right across from Victoria School. At that time, it would quickly be replaced by a new office building, which has been a dental offices for many decades now at the corner. Here's an interesting article about the Capitol Theatre from February 24th, 1979, speaking to Jack Byers. Byers objected to a Star Phoenix story earlier this week as having quoted him out of context. He said he, like some other Saskatoonians, has sentimental regard for the theatre, but he explained he does not consider it a historical building because it was built in 1929 and not earlier. So simply put, maybe if the building had been older, maybe we could have saved it. The Heritage Society got very involved with trying to save the building over the next 2 years. At least 40 articles in the Star Phoenix discussing the building. The Capitol Theatre Campaign. The Special Listing Committee and the Heritage Society campaigned hard to save Saskatoon's beloved Capitol Theatre on 2nd Avenue. Since 1974, when the theatre came up for sale, there had been a growing public interest in its fate. The province became interested and offered to share the cost of a feasibility study into its conversion into a performing arts venue. The offer was not taken up. In May 1979, a private member's bill sponsored by Saskatoon MLA Peter Preble gave City Council the power to protect the theatre for up to a year. However, it was ignored. In fall of 1979, the Heritage Society presented a 9,000-person petition organized by Pamela Burrell to City Council in an attempt to save the building. But on December 1st, the Capitol Theatre was demolished. The Heritage Society and local theatre groups were allowed to salvage artifacts from the theatre. The facade of the adjacent Bank of Nova Scotia, also demolished to the surprise of the Special Listing Committee, was eventually incorporated into an interior courtyard of the new development. The Heritage Society and the theatre groups assumed ownership of the artifacts. Some of these artifacts were leased to local businesses for use as part of their decor, while those remaining are being housed by the city. Many artifacts were displayed at the former Fire Hall No. 3, but now they are also in city storage. The demolition of the Capitol Theatre served to raise the profile of the heritage movement in Saskatoon. Here's a beautiful interior shot of the 1,700 seats in the largest movie theater Saskatoon ever had. And here we see the Bank of Nova Scotia building, the Capitol Theatre, and Burton Shoes buildings, which would all come down next to the Scotia Bank, which had been demolished just 2 years earlier. So this entire street was getting a facelift. Here's the current view of what would be built in its place. The Scotia Centre, with 2 high-rise buildings, many businesses and offices, and a lot of glass windows again to match the Scotia Bank. The city purchased the Marr residence at 326 11th Street East in August 1979, following persuasive lobbying by Heritage Society members Don Kerr and John Durkop. In the fall of 1979, Kate Waygood elected to City Council following her work with the Nutana Residents Association on the Nutana rezoning issue. She served for 24 years until 2003. She had a great influence on planning practices in Saskatoon and was a dedicated supporter of heritage preservation. She served as the Saskatchewan governor on the board of the Heritage Canada Foundation 1987 to 94. Following the demise of the Special Listing Committee in 79, an interim Heritage Advisory Committee was formed, chaired by Kate Waygood. At the exhibition grounds, the provincial building, which was put there in 1926, was demolished after 53 years, and it was located just right on Ruth Street, and now is just a little park area which would be called the Provincial Plaza of the Provinces. In 1979, the King Edward School on 25th Street caught on fire and was demolished. In its place eventually was built King Edward Place Apartments next to Kinsman Park. More saving heritage buildings was in the news constantly. And the Saskatoon Heritage Society started sponsoring a historical bus tour in June 1979, which would lead to the regular walking tours. In 1979, Meewasin Valley Authority was created to protect the South Saskatchewan River Valley in the Saskatoon area and to educate the public about the importance of its natural, cultural, and heritage resources. The first Heritage Festival was held at the Public Library in February 1980 as part of a national campaign spearheaded by Pierre Burton, chair of the Heritage Canada Foundation, to have the third Monday in February declared Heritage Day. The key organizers were Ruth Robinson of the Heritage Society and Mary Helen Richards. The Heritage Society organized subsequent heritage fairs to be followed by the city as part of its heritage programming and then by the partnership. Eventually, the fair became a project of a separately incorporated organization, Saskatoon Heritage Festival, which is still held annually at the WDM. The Queen's Hotel caught on fire in 1980 at 306 First Avenue South. The terrible fire killed 2 firefighters, and there is now a plaque on the movie theater, which is now in its place since 2006, Scotiabank Cineplex Entertainment Center, at the corner of 1st Avenue and 20th Street. That happened on May 31st. The hotel was demolished. The Heritage Society, under the leadership of John Durkop and in cooperation with the owners and the demolition company, saved one of the ornamental corner pediments, and the stones remain in storage. The Saskatchewan Heritage Property Act was proclaimed on November 28, 1980. And in June 1981, MHAC, Saskatoon's Municipal Heritage Advisory Committee, was formed using the authority of the Heritage Property Act. Its first chair was Don Kerr. Kate Waygood was the City Council representative. Here is the Bell Block. In 1980, this building was demolished at 521 18th Street West at the corner of Avenue F. The architect was David Webster, who created many of Saskatoon's landmark buildings, including the Castle Schools. The building would be eventually replaced by a multiplex residence at that corner. Saskatoon History #1, published by the Saskatoon Heritage Society under the urging of Don Kerr, happened in 1980, edited by Julie Harris. 2 others were published in the early 80s, and in 1989 it was renamed Saskatoon History Review and is now published annually to this date. Here's our first 2 issues from the early 80s. The Saskatoon Heritage Society sponsored tours and a tea at the oldest house in Saskatoon, the Marr Residence, in 1980. In June 1981, marker for the Bone Trail near Pike Lake was erected. Research support was provided by John Kirkup of the Heritage Society. The Bone Trail was designated as municipal heritage property by the RM of Corman Park in 1981. And the first municipal heritage properties were designated in Saskatoon under the Heritage Property Act in 1982. The Marr Residence, the Pioneer Cemetery near the exhibition, and the Little Stone Schoolhouse, originally on Broadway, now at the university grounds. On December 1st, 1982, the Heritage Society commemorated the demolition of the Capitol Theatre by walking through downtown Saskatoon with placards and a wreath. The walk was followed by a program with remarks by Peter Preble, poetry by Don Kerr, and the laying of the wreath by Saskatoon Heritage Society President Bob McPherson for its 3rd anniversary. 1982 was a big year for history in our city. Saskatoon held its 100th birthday centennial celebration, Century Saskatoon. As part of the celebration, 2 important books were published on the history of Saskatoon. Saskatoon by William Delaney, John Durkop, and William Sarjeant, and Saskatoon, the First Half Century by Don Kerr and Stan Hansen. And Peggy Sarjeant created her On Safari in Saskatoon tour, which is still used by the Heritage Society today. In 1982, the landmark John East Ironworks building, which had stood for over 70 years, was demolished on Avenue C and was eventually replaced by this newer Wallace Kruger Architects building at 121 Avenue C North. We used to have numerous elevators downtown, but the last one came down in 1983. It was owned by Early Seed and Feed, and you can see the grand elevator standing tall across from the CN Tower. Demolished in 1983, eventually replaced by the modern Cactus Club Cafe building. The bus depot, built in 1948, was demolished by 1985 at the busy northeast corner of 1st Avenue and 22nd Street. Here's an interior shot of the building. And eventually it was replaced by the Affinity Credit Union Bank building on the corner. In August 1984, the Crow Block, an example of early row housing located on 25th Street between 4th and 5th Avenue North, was demolished to make way for a convenience store. And the Mac store was built, and it would stand there for decades. It is now currently a Circle K building. Alexandra School, built in 1908, was located between Avenue G and H, south, just north of 20th Street. There were 2 schools, Princess and Alexandra, on this block. But Alexandra came down in 1984. And a brand new huge building was built for Safeway, and it is now the City Center Church building at 602 20th Street West. Back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of motor hotels and motels were built on 8th Street. By the mid-80s, they were all coming down. Here's the Greystone Motor Hotel at 2921 8th Street East, demolished by 1984. The building was only about 25 years old. It is now the Famoso little mini strip mall, also with TJ's Pizza. For a long time, it was a Pizza Hut restaurant. Back in the 1960s, the hot spot to go for 10-pin bowling was in this building, which would later become known as the Turner Building at 2602 8th Street East. It also had the Clean Shop in here for a long time, and the Bridge Club. It was demolished in 1984 to build a brand new modern strip mall and parking lot where Taco Time has been for decades. The AHEPA building at 117 20th Street East sat right to the east side of Queen's Hotel. And those buildings stood on that corner for over 60 years together. Queen's Hotel burnt down in 1980, and the AHEPA building was demolished in 1985. It is currently the center part of the Scotiabank Cineplex Theatre. The Nutana Legion used to be located on McEwen Avenue behind the Market Mall shopping mall. And you can see it in this photo. It's the large building with the blue-colored roof at the back of the parking lot. Well, they were there from about 1971 to 1986 when that building was demolished and Market Mall could expand their parking lot and eventually build a new building, which is now the home of Planet Fitness at the back of Market Mall. Lots of people talk about how grand the Capitol Theatre was, but until it was built, Saskatoon's finest theatre was the Daylight Theatre, originally on 22nd Street, but it moved in 1916 to 134 2nd Avenue South, and this was a 1,000-seat theatre, and the Capitol Theatre was built literally across from it, and they faced each other as competition for many decades. Eventually, the Daylight Theatre would be renamed the Paramount Theatre, and this was a popular place to see all the popular new movies. And the Paramount Theatre was demolished in 1986. It is currently a new strip mall building with numerous businesses and restaurants. TM Ball Lumber had a popular location down on Avenue A South, but then they opened a second branch at 614 9th Street East, and they were located here for 60 years, and this building was demolished in 1986 and turned into a large new apartment building. The second location of the Western Development Museum was on 11th Street at 1839, and if you look closely you can see an old sod house right in front of the building. The Western Development Museum was located here in 1952 until they moved to their new location in 1971. So for 19 years, this huge open building would be a huge display of vehicles, tractors, etc. And of course, they held Pioneera there every year back in those days. The building, unfortunately, had a tragic, massive fire and was destroyed in 1986. It is now an empty lot for Expocrete Distribution Center at 1801 11th Street West. In 1986, Drinkle Building Number 2 caught on fire on May 20th at the corner of 3rd Avenue South and 22nd Street. And of course, it would become demolished as well. And eventually, this bank office building was built at that corner. In 50 years, the Saskatoon Heritage Society has had over 100 different board members. Here is a list of our presidents over the 50-year period. Peggy Sarjeant has been president the most terms. And here are our vice presidents over the last 25 years. And here are our secretaries and treasurers over the last 25 years. The 1970s was a time of social awareness and for the first time appreciation of heritage and our environment. There was lots of action on the part of Bill Sargent, Don Kerr, and others involved in numerous boards relating to heritage throughout that decade. This general movement towards the preservation of heritage led to the need of forming a Saskatoon Heritage Society in June 1976 with Don Kerr as its first president. In its first 50 years, the Saskatoon Heritage Society, as a nonprofit organization, advocates for heritage issues, acts as a forum for heritage concerns, organizes special events to promote heritage awareness, publishes an annual journal, the Saskatoon History Review, provides historical-themed walking tours, and cooperates with local and provincial authorities in their heritage programming. In 50 years, the Society and its board members have put on hundreds of events, published 35 issues of the Saskatoon History Review Journal with over 150 of the most important historical articles ever written about Saskatoon, and we continue to educate and to protect our city's heritage.